flame wavers in the stillness, its light sliding across the walls like a secret trying not to be seen. Shadows curl in the corners, deep and heavy, as if even they are forbidden to move. The air is close here, thick with the faint sweetness of violet powder and the sharper note of heated wax. Outside these shuttered windows, Paris swells with unrest, but none of it breaches this room. Before the tall glass of a Venetian mirror, a figure sits utterly still, as if carved from the dim itself. The candle catches on a cheek just dusted with rouge, the powder falling in faint clouds with every careful stroke. A lace ruff rests high against the neck, its folds pressed not for ceremony, but for some private satisfaction. Gold glints at the base of pale fingers, too slender for the hilt of a sword, too adorned for the grime of the streets. The gown pools heavily at the marble floor, the silk whispering against stone whenever the body shifts. Every movement is deliberate, reverent, the slow drawing of a self that the daylight would not permit. The face in the glass does not belong to the monarch the crowds cheer. Here the eyes are softer, the mouth more certain, the expression unguarded. The candle flares once, throwing the figure's reflection into sudden clarity. For a breath you see the full truth. Not a king in state, but someone entirely apart from the crown. History will call him Henry III, the last of the Valois kings. But in this hour, in this silence, he is something the chronicles will not name. This is the story of the monarch who ruled two realms, one of power and one of self. He was born in the spring of 1551, in the gilded halls of Fontainebleau. Beneath ceilings painted with triumphs, he had not yet earned and prayers whispered for the survival of the Valois bloodline. From the moment he drew breath, his life was claimed, not as his own, but as a piece on the board of dynastic survival. His tutors began their work early. Latin, theology, statecraft, the languages of rule drilled into his mind with the same precision as a soldier's drills. History was not taught as stories, but as weapons. Examples of kings who had stood unyielding, and those who had been swept aside. In these lessons, a prince was not a child. He was a future instrument sharpened for the realm. Yet when lessons ended, he drifted elsewhere. Toward music rooms where lutes and viols hummed in the afternoon light. Toward embroidery frames, where patient hands wove silk into flowers more lasting than any bloom in the gardens outside. Toward the company of his sisters, where laughter softened the air and he could move without the weight of watchful eyes. But this was France in the 16th century. A kingdom forged in war, bound in faith, ruled by an image as rigid as iron. To be a man of the Valois was to embody the virtues the court demanded: bravery, virility, an unshakable devotion to the sword and the altar. There was little room for anything else. His mother, Catherine de Medici, understood better than anyone that power was perception. She schooled her children not only in alliances and treaties, but in the art of being seen, of controlling what others believed you to be. Reputation was survival. To fail in the theater of the court was to invite ruin. And yet, there were moments when he let the mask slip. At court entertainments, he would appear with a pearl sewn into his ear, a delicate chain at his throat, or a plume arranged just so in his hair. The gestures were small, almost playful, but they did not go unnoticed. Some found them charming, a sign of refinement. Others whispered that such beauty had no place on the brow of a prince. If details like this vanish from memory, history becomes a lie told by those who feared the truth. If you're still watching, make sure this isn't erased. Subscribe. As Duke of Anjou, he learned that power in France was not worn only in crowns and armor, but in the subtle cut of a sleeve, the scent carried on one's skin, the arrangement of a ruff at the throat. From Italy came perfumes distilled from orange blossom and musk, rich enough to cling for hours. His ruffs were starched and sculpted into intricate shapes, framing his face like a portrait. Powder dusted his hair until it caught the light in soft clouds, turning each movement into an act of presentation. To some, this was the mark of a cultivated prince, a man of letters and taste, a patron who brought refinement to a court still roughened by the mud of war. But to others, these flourishes were dangerous. Rival nobles, bred in the smoke and blood of battlefields, laughed behind their goblets, calling his grace effeminate, and his polish a sign of weakness. In a France torn between Catholic and Protestant factions, even beauty could be painted as treachery. Yet he played the game well. At tournaments, he appeared in gilded armor, jousting before cheering crowds, the very image of chivalric valor. At court banquets, he offered witty, sharp-edged remarks that could cut as cleanly as any sword. He performed the part expected of a prince, all the while in the spaces between ceremony shaping a different self. Behind closed doors, there were gatherings spoken of only in murmurs. Rooms lit by candlelight where the air was thick with incense, where music curled through the shadows, and where clothing blurred the line between male and female attire. These were not public masquerades. They were private sanctuaries, shared with a small circle of trusted companions who understood the rules without needing them spoken aloud. Diplomatic letters carried whispers of these meetings back to foreign courts. Ambassadors noted the unusual entertainments of the Duke of Anjou, their language careful but weighted, as if they knew their words could become weapons in the wrong hands. Each season, the distance between the man the court saw and the man he allowed himself to be grew wider. It was a dangerous tightrope. One misstep, one careless glimpse behind the curtain, and the image could shatter. In 1573, the death of a foreign king opened a door few thought he would walk through. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, vast and powerful, elected him as its new ruler, a decision shaped by politics, diplomacy, and the hope that a Valois prince could anchor their fragile balance of power. For Henry, it was a crown that came with distance. Distance from Paris, from the ever-watchful eyes of the French court, from the constant measurement of his every gesture against a rigid ideal. Krakow was a city of spires and market squares, where the air carried the scent of roasted meats, resin from pine torches, and the faint salt of trade winds from the Baltic. The palace he inhabited there became a theater unlike any in France. Masquerades spilled into the night, not the carefully staged pageants of the Louvre, but living, breathing performances. In these halls, men and women traded roles without hesitation. Velvet doublets paired with pearl-studded veils. Gowns swept across the floor, worn by figures whose voices could drop into a baritone laugh one moment and rise into lilting song the next. From Venice came crates of brocade, lace so fine it could be drawn through a ring, and silks dyed in colors the Polish court had never seen. Masks painted in gold leaf hid faces just enough to blur the lines of identity, making it possible to be someone else entirely for a few stolen hours. Polish chronicles, still kept in brittle, fading ink, recorded the king's fondness for these silks, for the theatrical play of light on fabric, for gatherings that seemed to dissolve the boundaries his homeland enforced. These were not careless indulgences. They were deliberate choices. Every fold of silk, every jewel placed just so, was a kind of coded language, a message to those who understood that presentation could be its own kind of armor. Here, in this foreign court, he could push further without saying a word. Yet even this freedom was fragile. Letters from Paris still crossed his desk, each one a reminder that his absence was temporary, and that beyond these walls, the narrow corridors of French power awaited. The only reason we know these details is because someone wrote them down before they could be burned. Don't let the last copies of history fade into silence. Subscribe. In 1574, the bells of Paris tolled not for celebration, but for death. Charles IX, his elder brother, was gone. The crown, heavy with centuries of blood and expectation, now waited for Henry. He left Krakow under cover of haste, slipping away from the Polish court he had barely begun to shape, knowing full well that the road home led into fire. France was already splintered. The Catholic League, sworn to defend the old faith, faced the Protestant Huguenots in a conflict that had soaked the soil in blood for more than a decade. Cities fortified themselves against one another. Country roads became corridors of suspicion. This was the France that awaited its new king, a kingdom that did not need elegance, but command. The public longed for a warrior monarch, a figure who would ride at the front of armies, sword in hand, banners snapping in the wind. What they received was a ruler who preferred the quiet precision of council chambers to the churn of the battlefield, who valued treaties over sieges, and the measured weight of a signature over the flash of steel. His appearance and manner, once a matter of courtly taste, now became political ammunition. Pamphleteers, cheap ink on cheaper paper, spread through the streets, their pages adorned with crude woodcuts of the king in women's gowns, lace draped over his shoulders, his face painted with powders and rouge. They accused him not only of moral decay but of bringing ruin to the very fabric of France. Around him, the circle of his mignons, young men of striking dress and polished speech, became both his shield and his scandal. Their loyalty was fierce, their presence constant, but their beauty, their silks, their laughter at court feasts only deepened the ridicule. Satirists painted them as parasites, feeding off the king's indulgence, and in doing so, made Henry himself the embodiment of what they feared. A France softened, corrupted, and unfit for war. If you think rumors can't rewrite history, look at Henry's story. Stay with us and make sure this truth travels further than the lies. Inside the stone heart of the Louvre, Henry carved out spaces that existed beyond the reach of ceremony and the prying eyes of the court. These were not the grand halls where ambassadors were received or treaties sealed. They were smaller, more intimate chambers, their walls hung with heavy drapes to muffle the sounds of the world outside. Candlelight pooled in low bowls of silver, casting a warm, almost dreamlike glow over everything it touched. Here, presentation was no longer bound by the rigid codes of the French throne. Gowns of satin and brocade moved alongside embroidered doublets. Jewels were worn by whoever chose them, their worth measured not in gendered expectation, but in how they caught the light. Italian perfumes hung in the air, rich blends of amber, citrus, and spice that lingered in the folds of lace from Bruges, and in the soft sheen of pearls brought from the Mediterranean. Foreign envoys who found themselves invited to these salons wrote of them in careful language. They noted the astonishment the gatherings inspired, the vivid colors, the precision of every stitched seam, the way the king's own attire could shift from martial severity one day to something layered and delicate the next. Some recorded this with admiration, others with cautious neutrality, but few dared to condemn outright. These rooms were more than indulgence. They were a sanctuary, a place where identity could stretch and shift without fear of the pamphleteer's ink or the mob's jeers. Every gown, every string of pearls, every soft step on marble was an act of quiet defiance, a refusal to let the narrow confines of a throne dictate the boundaries of the self. In a world where deviation could mean political ruin, these moments were dangerous and deliberate. In May of 1588, the streets of Paris became a battlefield without open war. The Catholic League, emboldened and furious, turned the city into a maze of barricades. Carts, barrels, and paving stones piled high blocked the king's own soldiers from moving freely. Bells rang from the steeples, summoning crowds that spilled into the narrow streets, their chants rising like a tide against the crown. Henry watched the city slip from his grasp. The capital, seat of his authority, was no longer his to command. Whispers from the barricades reached his ears, not of policy or law, but of the man himself. His enemies no longer confined their attacks to questions of faith or governance. They painted him as too soft to lead, too corrupted by vanity and indulgence to defend France. The pamphlets multiplied, cheap pages passed hand to hand, nailed to tavern doors, read aloud in the marketplaces. Their woodcuts were crude, but effective. The king draped in women's gowns, rouge on his cheeks, pearls at his throat. Captions accused him of betraying not only the faith but the very idea of manhood. In the eyes of the League's propagandists, effeminacy was not merely a personal failing. It was treachery, proof that the monarch himself was a threat to the stability of the realm. His private self, once only the subject of rumor and court gossip, had been weaponized. It was no longer a shadow he could control. It had been pulled into the streets, reshaped into a symbol of everything his enemies wanted the people to fear. This was the moment when the line between personal truth and political war disappeared entirely. When identity itself becomes a weapon, the truth depends on who tells the story. If you're still watching, you're part of the resistance. Subscribe. December 1588. The winter air at Château de Blois lay heavy and still, the corridors hushed beneath the weight of expectation. The Duke of Guise, towering figure of the Catholic League and master of Paris's fury, had come at the king's invitation. He believed he was to attend a council, another day of talk, of measured words and gestures. But Henry had already made his decision. The same king mocked in pamphlets as a perfumed ornament, draped in silk and lace, now moved with a precision colder than steel. In the early hours, Guise was summoned to the royal chambers. Guards, stationed in shadows, closed in before he could bow. Blades struck fast, cutting short a life that had seemed untouchable. News spread through the court like fire catching dry leaves. In Paris, the shock was instant. Not simply that Guise was dead, but that this king, painted as soft and delicate, had commanded the killing. Across Europe, ambassadors wrote in disbelief, their reports tinged with both awe and unease. The image the League had worked so hard to construct had been shattered in a single act. Yet the blow did not end the war. It only changed its shape. If Henry's enemies had once sought to humiliate him, they now sought his blood. The death of Guise lit a fuse that could not be extinguished. Somewhere, in the fevered plotting of the League's most devoted, the idea began to take root. If this king could kill their champion, then the king himself must not live. August 1589. The king's camp at St. Cloud lay within sight of Paris, its towers sharp against the summer haze. Alongside Henry of Navarre, he prepared for the final push to reclaim the city. Tents stood in ordered rows, the air heavy with the mingled scents of oiled leather, dust, and the faint rot of an army kept too long in one place. Among the arrivals that morning was a Dominican friar, robes plain, head bowed in piety. He carried letters sealed and urgent, said to be from allies inside the capital. The king, always attentive to matters of state, received him without suspicion. Jacques Clement stepped forward, murmuring words of devotion, and then the flash of steel cut the air. The blade drove into Henry's abdomen, the heat of the strike followed by the spreading cold of mortal wound. Guards fell upon the friar, but it was already too late. Carried to his chamber, the king's face was pale, his breath shallow. In those final moments he spoke not of revenge, but of succession. He named Henry of Navarre his heir, knowing that only such a choice could hold France back from tearing itself apart. By nightfall, the last Valois king was dead. His enemies moved swiftly, sanctifying his killer, shaping the memory to fit their cause. The man who had ruled two courts, one of power, one of self, was buried beneath the version of history they chose to tell. His private truth, the self seen only in the glow of candlelight and the quiet of closed doors, was sealed away with him. If you leave the story without acting, you're letting the same silence win again. Subscribe, or tell me in the comments why this history shouldn't be told. History's memory of Henry III is a narrow one. A monarch draped in decadence, painted as corrupt, mocked for his elegance, reduced to a cautionary figure of weakness. The chronicles repeat the same words, the same caricatures, until they harden into truth. But beneath the ink and the rumor was a man who navigated a life under constant threat, carving out moments of self in a world that denied him the right to exist on his own terms. The question lingers, sharp as any blade. Was his so-called weakness a fabrication, a myth forged by enemies who feared what they could not control? Or was it, in truth, a kind of strength, the courage to live, however partially, in defiance of a system that demanded complete obedience to its vision of power, gender, and worth? He ruled between barricades and salons, between war councils and private chambers lit by a single candle. In the eyes of the state, he was a king. In the sanctuary of his own making, he was simply himself. Here in Echoes of Time, we bring back the voices the past tried to silence, because silence is history's deadliest weapon.